Today on Cumulus on Cloud, we're going to talk more about NoOps, this time looking at Knative, a new technology coming from our friends at Google. Those of you that have been following me recently realize that I've been talking a lot about this concept of NoOps and really trying to find what people really mean by it. I think some of the early concepts, some of the earlier articles that I read at least that were sort of talking about, oh, NoOps is the new development paradigm, we're sort of saying what I've been saying for a while, which is that developers really do not want to do operations. That is not where they want their efforts spent. And in reality, as a business owner, I don't either. I can't imagine that you want your developers who are focused on creating new features and value in your application space to be focused on how you actually run that thing. Now, the first shift happened in the Kubernetes space when Kubernetes came about, and actually the technologies before that. I'm not saying Kubernetes was the answer. It just sort of has become the answer over time. But Kubernetes started to really shift where the developers were able to place their focus because they were able to define more of their application as a platform service, but still have a lot of flexibility and control about how their resources fit together, how things scaled or didn't scale. So they still had a lot of the operational control over their application while potentially getting rid of having to think about a lot of the underlying infrastructure. And part of that really came from containerization, where I could sort of separate my application from the operating system it was running on top of. So somebody else could now handle the operating system, and I, as the developer, could think about just what does my application need to run? I still have to operate that container in that I have to consider security of the container, the resources that I might place in that container, any libraries or any code that I'm going to inject into that container and hold on to within that containerized package. But I've reduced my focus. My application view is now still more on my application and the pieces needed to make it run than it is on all of the rest of the infrastructure that's required there. Another piece of this puzzle that's come along recently, again, not that Istio is the answer, although it seems like that's the one that's getting the most traction recently, but there have been a number of service mesh technologies that have been around, and those technologies have focused on how do I take these little application bundles, especially if I'm thinking microservices, and put them together and make them actually function. I think there are a number of other components as well. We look at sort of how you deal with state and stateful applications and the reality that there is operations that goes on behind that. People have talked for quite a while now about database as a service for the specific reason that managing databases is actually a bit of a challenge. And an application developer really doesn't want to take their time, their brain power, again, wants to focus on the functionality of the application rather than how do I make sure I have my database backed up? How do I recover from a failure of the database? How do I deal with a multi-system database like a Redis cluster or Cassandra cluster? If I lose one node, how do I bring another node back in? Those are all operational complexities that have to be handled in some fashion, but can be handled by code much more efficiently than they can be handled by the application team itself. And so we see the Kubernetes Operator space. So we see a number of these different components coming together. And what Knative, Google's new announcement from about a week ago now at their Google Next conference, is really trying to do is trying to say, well, can we build a framework where all of these pieces can play together in a controlled function, or controlled fashion rather. So do I have one controller that can manage all of those different pieces together? And I think that's where Knative is coming into play. Now, to be clear, this is a new technology. It is considered alpha, 0.1 release code. Really, they have one workflow, one path through this whole concept that they're trying to present that's currently functional, and that is a function as a service approach. So this is the idea of being able to use a containerized process, basically a package of just the application itself. And often people are thinking about a little piece of Go code that can be potentially completely compiled into a static binary, or maybe it's a Node.js application with a couple of libraries bundled together, but they're bundled together in a container. That's sort of the packaging model that I have. Now, the next question is, when do I run that? When do I turn that service on? And then the function as a service space, we're talking about turning that on as I have a need. So as a request comes in against my system, I want to actually turn on that container, actually affect some code, have the code run, and then if I don't need it anymore, if I don't have another connection request or another request for that service coming in, I want to get rid of that. So I want to scale this system up and down. So what Google's done with Knative is they've taken a couple of pieces of the puzzle. They've taken the concept of a Kubernetes operator, and effectively Knative is an operator service for the environment. They've taken the Istio service mesh with its routing capability and effectively its circuit breaker engine. So this is a TCP proxy engine that can handle receiving a request and holding on to it until the back end for that is available. In other words, understanding exactly when I should time out that request or when I can just continue on and give you access to that service. And then we take the actual functionality of the Knative server and say, well, okay, now this controller is going to deal with your function. So you're going to tell it what function, where's your container, where's your packaged service effectively available, and what kind of scale does it need. So we're going to give it a little bit of control information, and then it's going to take it from there. So once I've exposed the endpoint, basically once I've exposed my service through Istio, and Knative is handling all of that, I'm just telling it, hey, here's my bundle. It's a small little YAML document. And then maybe that's the one real glitch here still. At that point, I'm now able to use that service and it can actually deploy for me. It can effectively handle the process of managing the scale up and scale down of that resource. If I replace that resource service with a new version, Knative will eventually be able to deal with the upgrade, downgrade, sort of rolling upgrade process as well. There's already some capability built into Kubernetes. It doesn't seem like it's in Knative yet, or maybe I missed that specific function. But it's really new technology at this point. I do see this as part of the path forward. Now, I did mention the fact that there's still a YAML document describing the service. And certainly, there's always going to be some need for the creation of a description of my application. I think where we're going to get in the near future is things that look more like the Draft.sh environment. So Draft, if you haven't looked at it, is a Helm manager. So Helm was a tool that was built a couple of years back to try to help capture all of the different tools and manifests and resources needed to describe how you would turn on an application in the containerized space. This was, in a sense, at the same time that the service mesh and Kubernetes were starting to merge in terms of technology capabilities and needs. And I think what we saw, at least over the last year, was that Draft changes how a developer thinks about interacting with Kubernetes. And this, to me, is part of this whole NoOps move. If I can change how I think about interacting with my system, I can change how I think about the services that actually tie all these resources together. I can start thinking more about my application. And yes, I might still have to manipulate the manifest files. I might still have to deal with some uniqueness in how my application needs to be operated. But what Draft did, which I think is a useful addition and something that I expect to see in the Knative space, is provided a default set of templates. You have a Java application, no problem. We can take that, give you a basic Docker file as long as you follow normal processes. So there were some standards that were sort of embedded into the Draft environment for how you write your code, how you compile your code, and then how you actually Dockerize or containerize that code. There were some defaults that were built into Draft for Java and Erlang and Haskell and Python and Node and Go, etc. All of these have some default models, or you can build your own model called a pack to describe the application. And the nice thing about the Draft model is you can say Draft create, and now you have your sort of your framework to build from. This was very similar to the Helm create as well. So I could have Helm create an initial set of charts. Well, Draft sort of takes that one step further and says, well, yeah, but you need a Docker file for your application. You need to talk to a registry to store that application somewhere. All these pieces need to function. And then when I actually want to turn my application on, I use the draft up command for that in the Draft space. Draft will actually containerize your application, so it'll run the Docker build command to follow the Docker file for you. It'll then push that into the registry. It'll take the Helm chart and make sure that the right version of your container is now mapped in that chart as a value, and will tell the Helm tiller application, the application that's out in the Kubernetes cluster, to now launch that resource and pull from your container registry to actually enable your application. So if you look at that front-end model that Draft has with the back-end model that Knative has, now we have sort of the two pieces of a serverless function environment working in conjunction with each other, where I could actually tell Knative, that's the thing I would push effectively into Kubernetes rather than the Helm chart, to say, go ahead and launch and run this particular container. And if I create a new one, I effectively automatically inject that updated information into the Kubernetes environment. This is where we're going with NoOps, in my view. from the application developer perspective. I'm using things like a Git repository, and actually in the sense, I don't even need something like Draft. I could use a GitOps workflow where whenever I trigger something into Git, the Git post commit triggers actually can go and compile my code, run my validation tests, etc., and then finally release this into production environments. So there are a lot of flexible components that are coming together and creating an easier application development environment for application developers. And that's the real shift in NoOps, is taking as much of the operations and turning it into automated processes as possible, simplifying how the application developer enables their application into that environment. Having done this even just 6 months ago with a simple Ruby on Rails app, there are still some real challenges in the developer environment and the developer mindset, even in advance of containerization, and the operations mindset of, well, now how do I keep this thing running? How do I upgrade the processes and the parts as they go? In the Rails thing, for example, I have to migrate my database if I change my database schema at all. How do I make sure that happens as a part of the upgrade process? There are many things within that space that are outside of the classic cloud native, oh, my application is just a function and I don't care about anything else, which is not really true, by the way. But I really need to be able to sort of fit all those pieces together. And that's the big shift we're seeing. And I think Knative is a step in the right direction to enabling that by providing a function as a service model against Kubernetes as a part of the mental picture for how application developers can remove themselves more and more from the overall operation space while still thinking about how they want to operate their application. Want to use functions? Right now you could use something like Knative. I just have a set of containers. Maybe I have to manually manipulate my Istio rule sets, but I can use something like a Draft service to actually get those containers deployed into production. So these are the spaces, these are the changes that are happening, and I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk about Knative, yet another new technology helping make all of our lives a little bit easier. This has been Robert Starmer bringing you Kumulus on Cloud. We really look forward to continuing to bring you episodes of this nature. If you're really interested and enjoyed what you saw here, don't forget to share, subscribe. Don't forget to click the little bell in YouTube so that you actually get notified when we release new episodes. We have a podcast where this material is also available, so if you prefer to get this that way, don't forget to look up our podcast. And of course, we have a newsletter to keep you up to date, not only on when we release new versions of this kind of content, but also other content where I might be speaking if you actually wanted to see me live or come talk to me live, and other things that are happening in the cloud space that we think might really be of interest to you. We really look forward to having you sign up for our newsletter. Kumul.us/newsletter is where you'll find that. Follow us on Twitter, etc. We really do enjoy having you here and look forward to continuing our cloud journey together.